Very good. How about you? Welcome. Shall I get started? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Crossroads of Ideas, How Failure Fuels Innovation. And I must just say, given how cold it is tonight, I'm very proud of all of you, and thank you for coming out this evening. And I will share with you a little fact. Beneath your feet right now is a new floor. This is the first event with this new floor. So you're the folks to break in this new floor. So I hope you appreciate the new floor that you're sitting on. I'm Jon Eckhardt, professor in Wisconsin School of Business and Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. My area of expertise is entrepreneurship. I manage a research team in this building that is applying data science to improve entrepreneurship at UW-Madison and beyond. I'm also currently serving as special advisor to the chancellor for entrepreneurship to implement UW-Madison's new founder-forward strategy for entrepreneurship. John, that's your cue. Very good. All right. This approach was developed by a working group of alumni, faculty, and entrepreneurs, the folks on the screen you see here behind me. You can get involved and read more about our new approach by reading the report available at entrepreneurship.wisc.edu or by using the QR code that's right behind me. You can take a picture of it. Today's event marks our first Crossroads of Ideas in 2026 and the first of our three-part mini-series on productive failure in science. Crossroads is a series presented by the Illuminating Discovery Hub at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery and developed collaboratively with UW-Madison and Discovery Building partners. Crossroads of Ideas brings together campus experts and community members to explore thought-provoking topics at the intersection of science, society, and the arts. Since its launch in 2014, the series has been a cornerstone of public programming at Discovery Building, fostering dialogue, curiosity, and connection across disciplines. We're delighted to have you with us for this conversation tonight. Before I say more about this evening's event, we'll take a moment to acknowledge the land that we occupy here at the Discovery Building. The Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, UW-Madison, acknowledges that it occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation, known as the Jope, which means 4 lakes. The Ho-Chunk have stewarded this land and its waterways, Mendota, Monona, Wabisa, and Kaganza, since time immemorial, maintaining deep cultural, economic, and spiritual ties. We honor their historical sovereignty and the shared strength of standing together with all First Nations of Wisconsin. Tonight, we're here to explore a topic that is fundamental to innovation and a pursuit of truly novel ideas and outcomes: failure. In my view, you're not really a scientist if you don't fail, probably a lot. There are many ways to conceptualize failure, but perhaps one place to start is to consider just 2 types: expected failure and catastrophic failure. Expected failure is central to the scientific process and also entrepreneurship, where one runs experiments and tries ideas that won't work until a discovery is made and something starts working. So it's day after day, sometimes year after year of like not working, no, and then maybe the success. What this means is that without failed attempts, there really is no discovery, which means in this building every day, there's lots of failure happening as part of what we do. Catastrophic failure, on the other hand, might be thought of as a failure that is fundamentally disruptive to one's objectives. Perhaps a failure of a lab to secure funding and it has to close, or maybe a company goes bankrupt. While often not expected, right, that's potentially an outcome from starting a lab or a company, it certainly is something we try to avoid. Tonight we can talk about both or other ways to conceptualize failure as well. To help us better understand failure and in the pursuit of innovation, we have 2 amazing individuals with us this evening, Dr. Saha and Dr. Adhira Sunkara. Chris is a professor of biomedical engineering, pediatrics, and bioethics at UW-Madison and holds the Retina Research Foundation Catherine and Latimer Murphy Chair at the McPherson Eye Research Institute. His lab here at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery focuses on gene editing and the retina and cell therapy manufacturing, work shaped by interdisciplinary collaboration and strategic pivots in response to scientific challenges. I suspect failure is part of what you do every day. Trained at Cornell, Cambridge, and Berkeley, and a former Branko Weiss Fellow at MIT and Harvard, he's published over 100 manuscripts, filed multiple patents, earned major national awards, and co-led large-scale initiatives such as the NSF Center for Cell Manufacturing Technologies and the NIH Somatic Cell Genome Editing Consortium. Welcome, Chris. Dr. Adhira Sunkara is a founder, innovation strategist, and ecosystem builder with a PhD in biomedical engineering and deep expertise helping scientific ideas become scalable ventures. She has supported more than 800 startups. That's a lot. That is a lot. Through designing statewide innovation programs, building cross-sector coalitions, and securing federal, state, and private funding to advance high-impact technologies. Her work includes co-leading one of Wisconsin's most ambitious ag tech innovation efforts, a semifinalist in NSF Regional Innovation Engines program, bringing together more than 60 partners across academia, industry, tribal communities, and other organizations. Wow. Thank you very much for both of you being with us this evening. Our format is that we'll first start with 10 minutes or so, approximately, of remarks from each of our two distinguished guests on their experiences related to resilience, iteration, curiosity, and how the process of discovery in science and entrepreneurship is rarely linear. After the remarks, I'll get things going by asking some questions, and then at some point I'll turn the conversation over to you so you folks can ask questions as well. I'm inherently curious, so if you run out of steam tonight, maybe the cold has gotten to your bones, I'll jump back in and keep things going. Otherwise, we'll have a conversation until about 8 o'clock when we'll wrap things up. So with that, let's get started with Chris. And thank you for coming.
All right. Thanks, John. It's wonderful to be here. I'm excited for the conversation. And, I'd imagined I'd be up on this stage talking about all these great breakthroughs, but here I am talking about failure. As you said, it's part of the process. The word failure actually is something that I don't use very much as a scientist and engineer. We think about testing hypotheses or exploring parameter space. And, many times we come up with a result and we say, okay, that's disproved the hypothesis or proved the hypothesis one way or another, but rarely do I say you failed to a student. And part of that is because we're really looking to learn is what did you observe and how did you use it to reframe how you approach a problem or concept. And so, I wanted to tell you about kind of 3 stories, one of my own and 2 of my students, of kind of controlled fails or recoverable fails and how it really led to innovation. So the first story is my own. My doctoral work a long time ago was this concept of trying to make a particular cell type, neurons, in the brain for regenerative medicine. And this is a story about biomaterials. At that point, we knew how to do some elegant chemistry to control both different proteins on the surface of these materials that we were making. And the idea was, and the challenge was, to make stem cells become neurons. And so I worked years and years. I did these experiments. And every time I looked at my outcomes, there were not neurons. Instead, there were astrocytes, supporting cells in the brain, but not really the cells that convey information. And so, I thought hard, and my advisor said, well, astrocytes have a function too. Sometimes they go and sense glial scars that are stiff. And so that insight helped me think about that failure as a mode of changing the mechanics of our materials. And fast forward a lot of hard work, by tuning the mechanics, we were able to get neurons to some extent. It wasn't the glorious, easy experiment that I came in and result I was looking for, but it is one of my most cited papers to this day. And it's not in one of these flagship journals. It's just as a first observation that really was useful for the field. So fast forward a lot of years, and to my lab here on the 4th floor, there are 2 students. One, Dan Capabianca, who is now doing a postdoc. He is trying to make a particular type of immune cell therapy. So this is a CAR T cell therapy. There's 7 of these. They are engineered T cells that you manipulate and manufacture and put back into the patient to go in and recognize and eliminate cancer. And so we've been thinking about how to engineer these cells, and his project was to make more of them. So manufacturing is actually a challenge. 20% of these types of manufacturing runs at one point were failing, so these are serious issues. And I did use the word fail, and in that case it's binary. You didn't make a successful product, and that's a challenge for research. So he, one day in lab, was trying to make more and more CAR T cells, and then he ended up picking up the wrong vial of media, this set of factors that are in there. And lo and behold, when he observed what happened, he actually didn't get more cells that he was looking for. But there was one other characteristic, a really important characteristic of having a more memory-like quality that was really important. And he essentially stumbled on this by a outcome that didn't hit the metric that they was trying to meet, which was more cells, but he saw something that was better quality cells. And so that ended up becoming a large part of his thesis. He published on it. He kept, in some ways, failing to make more cells, but he ended up making better quality cells. And in many ways, that's arguably better. We don't have to actually make as many of the original cells we were thinking about, but we're making more potent cells. And then the last story is a story of another student, Lauren Sarko, who's just graduated last month. And her project was to make these same types of CAR T cells, but to try to eliminate plaques in the brains of Alzheimer's disease mice as a model. And so she made these cells that could recognize this molecule in senescent cells, these dysfunctional cells in the brains that surround plaques, and tried to eliminate them. These are, UPAR is the molecule that she targeted. And she made and did all of this hard work, designed this genetic construct to do that in mouse T cells. And as her control arm, rather than being able to recognize the mouse cell, she had a separate design that would recognize the human version of it. And that was supposed to not work because it doesn't recognize the mouse version. And so she came into my office and said, look, I'm not getting the result I expected. My controls are always doing better than what I had my experimental arm. And, she's like, I keep failing to do, to get the result I was looking for. And what she stumbled upon was this way in which just making these cells in the manufacturing part of this process, it was a new mechanism that we call directed fratricide. And fratricide is a term from that she said I only heard it in Shakespearean novels, but it's killing your own brother. And so actually what was happening is that these T cells in the human version, because we were making them in human cells, would automatically sense the dysfunctional cells that were being produced by our culture and killing them, which is great because we don't want these dysfunctional cells in a product, and amplifying the cells that we want. And so now this is something that became her thesis and is a way for us to not only make that type of CAR T cell product, but can be applied to many other types of CAR T cell products for cancer and autoimmune disease, et cetera. So, okay, so these are kind of small scientific stories. I told you about kind of controlled failure. I think it's really important to also consider some of the kind of systemic risks that Jon mentioned. We have a culture here at WID, I think, that has thought about failure in a kind of controlled way, but also recovery from failure. Resilience is a theme that we've been thinking about deeply in our systems. And but there are serious boundaries and catastrophic things that we should really plan for. And one of these in our field is adverse events in clinical trials. So the field of gene therapy has seen now with a particular type of virus that they use to shuttle in genes, this adeno-associated virus, that you can have liver toxicity. And unfortunately, some patients have died from these types of infusions when they've had too much of this toxicity. And so, there's a whole patient community that will say, we're willing to take on those risks. And if a patient dies in a trial, we don't think of it as a failure for the entire field of gene therapy. We should just, as a field, understand that we're pushing the envelope, and these are risky experiments, because in gene therapy in particular, in the 2000s, there was a kind of a big divestment from the field from a high-profile death, Jesse Gelsinger in 2000. And so in some ways, it's a mindset as not only in a lab, but also as kind of a culture in a field. And I think in some ways, I'd love to explore how to establish these types of cultures that not only is comfortable with failing in some of these more smaller ways, like I've done and folks in my lab have done in my lab, but also in arguably higher stakes, and how do we prepare for that? So I think I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Chris. Adhira.
All right. Well, those examples you gave are amazing. In fact, when I was thinking about this panel we were going to have, one of the examples that kept coming into my head was Alexander Fleming and his discovery of penicillin, right? Like, he just had essentially a botched experiment and found that where this mold was growing in his petri dishes, there was no bacterial growth around it. And he said, okay, well, what is this? And he discovered penicillin. And the second example you gave with your grad student kind of reminded me of that, right? There's some serendipity, but I also think there is more to it than that, right? It wasn't, there is a certain level of scientific curiosity and trust in what you're observing and data that goes with it, without which he would have just thrown away the petri dishes. And I wonder how many scientists have done that, right? You're at the verge of a discovery, you think you have a failure, you're disappointed because you're expecting a certain outcome, and you're not evaluating the actual outcome that you've gotten. In fact, Marie Curie is another example of that, right? When she was, getting data that contradicted at that time, the understanding of what an atom is, people thought an atom was stable, right? And she discovered radioactivity, and none of her data matched the models. And so, when faced with kind of conflicting things like that, I think the real pivot from failure to productive failure happens when you trust the data, when you trust your observations, and when you don't go in with preconceived notions of what the solution should be, right? I think going back to what you were saying, Chris, like, you don't go in saying, this is a failed experiment and this is a successful outcome for an experiment. You go in saying, I have a hypothesis. Is this experiment going to prove or disprove it? I wanted to share a couple of examples from my experience too, and maybe go beyond the lab. So as Jon mentioned, I've been working with startups, predominantly technologies that are university-based, and thinking about how do you bring them to market, right? It's amazing the discoveries that happen on campuses, but the percentage of those that actually make it out to the market or to a patient are very, very small. And so thinking about all of those other places where that failure can happen. Obviously, it can happen right there on the bench, but it can also happen if you are in a situation where there's no market need for the invention or innovation that you've come up with. Or maybe there is a market need, but it's too small. Or maybe there is no capital available for you. Or maybe, and this happens sometimes with the real great geniuses, maybe you're a little too cuckoo for any investors to put money into your company, right? Or it could be something as trivial sometimes as, wrong place, wrong time on an invention. We've working with university innovations. I know most of you may be familiar with the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, or WARF. I don't know. I don't want to repeat stories. Like, how many people know the story of vitamin D here? Okay, I think that enough people do. I'll be quick. But that is an example where it was an innovation that was incredible in and of itself. But what really, truly made the impact wasn't just figuring out how to get vitamin D reliably into milk. Because at that point, people already knew how to get vitamin D into some other food products. They knew that you needed to be out in the sun. We knew how to cure rickets, right? Not cure, but prevent rickets. But what Harry Steenbach did when he discovered the process that could be used to put vitamin D in milk is he patented the process. Because the failure wasn't happening on the innovation side here. The failure was happening on the market side, because at that time, without the regulations, people would slap on a label and said, here we go, my milk has vitamin D, when it didn't. Or they were using processes that were not properly tested or regulated, and so they think they were putting vitamin D in things that they weren't putting vitamin D in. And so one of the things, like what Chris ended on, is this idea of systems and frameworks, right? So the failure can happen outside of individual innovations and scientific inventions. And I think that's one of the things that I've personally learned a lot from all of these startups that I've seen. I will just say, of all the startups that I have worked with or advised or been part of, very few of them have been successful. I hope I'm not the factor there. But a lot of the times, the reason is, when you're that early or at the lab stage, the chances of making it all the way to a commercial project are minuscule. There's just so many places where you can fail. So the question is, do you avoid that failure? And Jon kind of posed this, right? We're not running away from these failures only by accepting them and by making, coming up with more experiments and coming up with more company ideas or more market approaches that have a high rate of failure. Can you make those really big breakthroughs? So I guess what I wanted to share was one of my very small breakthroughs when I was 20 years old. I was finishing up my bachelor's in biomedical engineering. We were doing our senior design project. This is where I got the entrepreneurship bug, by the way. Because at that time, I was like, I'm going to be a scientist. I'm going to do science for the rest of my life. I'm going to be a professor. Sorry, I could have been in the lab next to you. But we created this little thing. It was supposed to take saliva from neonates and filter it and make it really easy to do like DNA testing. This was way back before before all of these DNA testing companies existed. So we thought it was super cool. And so we created this mock-up, and we take it to a hospital and we show it to a nurse. And you can see that she's trying, we're like these eager 20-year-olds, she's trying really hard not to laugh. And she looks at it and goes, have any of you ever seen a baby? Okay, we're like, I think so. She goes, this thing you've created is the size of the baby's head. How is it gonna put it in its mouth? And that's when, that's when we were like, okay, you need to do your customer discovery. The solutions that you come up with have to be motivated by the problems that your users are actually experiencing. And it's funny now, but in that moment, man, we were devastated. And that was one of those failures that, not just changes the trajectory of the work you're doing, but can also impact you personally. And so I wanted to share the little personal story. And I have like 100 of these where we were just in the wrong market or at the wrong time, but I won't go through all of them.
One thing we often talk about in the business context, at least, is like this fail fast kind of mentality.
Right.
Like get out there, fail fast, and everything else. I think they're really, trying to capture the idea that, you're starting off, and if you have a bad idea, then you want to know sooner rather than later. And so let's get going and kind of get that rejection sooner rather than later so we can be more efficient and maybe have enough capital to try a couple other ideas. But there is a big minus of that, because then you might be starting things that aren't really well thought out, and you're wasting money on things that should have never been tried. So on the other side, there's kind of the, think through your theory very careful, and the experiment that you're designing, and then put it out there, and then do your testing. How do you two balance this, like, fail fast versus, maybe move a little bit slower, maybe learn a little bit slower, but your attempts might be higher quality, if that's a way of thinking about it?
I mean, I can start. Certainly in the translational space, when we're trying to move, for us, a gene therapy into an approved product, as Adhira said, it takes arguably 5 to 10 years or longer. A lot of the focus is actually on scaling and manufacturing. And sometimes, there's not enough attention paid to it when you go from lab to a centralized manufacturing, and you need to do it not only with one person but with a team of 100 or something, and sometimes investors don't want to hear that, and they say, okay, you failed. And there's kind of a story in the antibody engineering field, which Genentech is kind of held up as the place where they actually gave they had a long time horizon, such that they could incrementally go from a particular gram per liter type of yield to like 100, but they didn't do it overnight. It took years of tweaking a process. And right now in our field of making kind of viral gene therapies, there's not one central company that's doing this. So like, there's VCs that go in and fund. They start a company, they don't hit a clinical benchmark, they disband, they go to a whole nother new company, but there's no memory, there's no NDA. They just don't learn from the failure of the previous experience. Whereas the argument in the antibody field is that Genentech learned every time they didn't hit a benchmark. So part of this is like, you're trying to do something really hard, and how early do you, totally start from scratch, whereas you keep some of the team and then you build upon what you learned from before. And part of it is not really only people, but it's data, materials, infrastructure, capital, and organization, culture. Like, all of this goes into getting to a successful kind of translated product.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too and say, I love the fail fast concept, but I think to contextualize it, you're not failing at a whole thing, right? Like, you're failing, you break your experiment or your hypothesis or your company, whatever it is, or your market, into small, testable hypotheses. And you may or may not hit the mark on several of those. And so I love the idea of fail fast, because that's what you're taught as in entrepreneurship class, right? But it's also important to be resilient sometimes, right? Because as we are hearing, sometimes what you hear or think is a failure could actually be a signal that's buried within the noise that's around it. And so how are you extracting that signal from those experiments, from those failures, and figuring out that feedback loop? And like Chris was saying, if you're not learning from your previous mistakes, then you're not getting that feedback loop. Then it doesn't matter how many times you fail. You have to kind of take that next step and learn from it. And I also just wanted to say, I know there's a lot of like discussion and debate in science about, in several scientific areas, about, are you publishing negative results? Because, that's not going to make it into Nature or into these high prestige journals. And so a lot of times, negative results don't even get published, right? And so how can you expect the field as a whole to learn from failure if those failures aren't made public and published? So off my soapbox now.
All right. I agree with that. There is this huge publication bias because of that very thing, where we don't really systematically share our failures as scientists as we do our successes. I want to turn to like a little more of a personal part of this a little bit, and just ask you more of this kind of question. Is that one of the things that's really amazing about this institution is that scientists can pick up a problem and say, hey, like I'm going to work on this, and this is like a 10-year thing. 5-10-year thing, which means like I'm going to go for a long period of time and maybe not really generate any observables that I'm on the right path while I'm trying to figure this thing out. And there's not many institutions in the world besides in academia that kind of have this kind of special environment. But what that does mean is you're going to the office like every day after day and into your lab day after day if you're picking up one of these problems, and you're getting like no positive reinforcement maybe, and probably like a lot of negative reinforcement. How do you deal with that? How do you train your colleagues and students and so on and about this issue of like, you pick up a hard problem, how do you deal with like many months, days, years of no positive feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that from maybe a little bit more of an entrepreneurial lens.
Yeah.
I think, yes, scientists and startup founders are probably two of the biggest groups of people that face that problem. They both have kind of a longer term goal, especially if you're kind of doing deep tech entrepreneurship, right? It's not let's build a company and here we go. 2 years later, we're Tesla. But if you're going to, so the kind of resilience that's needed to start a company or a research project, it's tremendous, and it's not one where you're relying a lot on external signals. You rely a lot on the internal signals. This idea of like breaking things into smaller pieces and failing fast, that's a great feedback loop to get. So I'm a startup founder and my husband is a scientist, so we've got like both ends of this. So it's also really nice to have a supportive spouse. That's what I would say, to get some of that feedback. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy we're talking about this mindset, because it is something that's a challenge for especially high achievers. So, I mean, I think one of the large challenges that I didn't appreciate until I became a professor is that, as an undergrad, you take classes, you answer questions, and pass tests. As a graduate student, you pretty much do the opposite. You try things, you fail many times, right? You go off into tangents, and it can be a shock for a lot of students. And some of my colleagues say your primary role is to be a therapist, and I don't think that's exactly right, but there is, I think, as you said, a support structure that you need that is in special places like WID and in Madison, and really in a kind of research community that understands kind of the difficulty of the challenge that's in front of you. And so to me, like talking about failure, talking about process, sharing negative results, telling people that like, the building carbon dioxide went out and therefore everything, died. That actually does happen, and how do you recover from that? And that is part of science. It's not what you see as kind of the Hollywood version of the science, but talking about the journey to the discovery in some ways is just as essential in the training of how you approach failure and get to innovation.
One thing I share with my trainees and myself, I discovered this like in my third year, and it was just like so much bad news and like not any really, really good news, is that I decided to explicitly manage something I call the good news cycle. And what I try and do is like have enough, I've got this big project that I'm working on, and I try and have enough little things out there that any day I could open up my email and get some good news, right? And explicitly do that, like apply for like a little tiny grant or some award or something like that, so that there's a chance you could get good news while you're getting a lot of bad news along with your big project. And the other thing is that I got a dog, and every day, it doesn't matter what happened in my life, this dog is just so happy to see me that it's a good reinforcement mechanism as well. So one other thing I kind of wonder about sometimes is when you're going through this, you pick up a big problem and you're going through a period of time where there's a lot of failure, and sometimes you see this glimmer because you're right there. Like you're in this information flow, a scientific flow, and you actually start to get more excited because you see the path. But at the same time, you have grant agencies and investors and everything else. They're not with you every day on this project or in this lab. How do you keep them engaged, supporting your work when you're going through this period of time where like you can't show them like, well, here's the product, here's the revenue, here's the contract, here's the discovery. Maybe you need more money and more help. How do you keep your supporters behind you?
I think it's storytelling, right? I mean, there is a lot of training also here in WID on communication and being able to paint the picture of what you see and to make that compelling to various audiences. And that is part of being able to, I think, convince not only your scientific colleagues, but the broader public and including investors what is the potential path out there. And I guess the culture here in the U.S. is that you have to be able to tell compelling stories based on what you see. I mean, there's all sorts of examples that you can go overboard, so you have to be very careful in this, and it's not easy. But that's part of also our training, right? It's part. I mean, before it was like you write a paper and you wait and get it published in a journal, and it takes the usual kind of paper-based way of diffusion. Now it's preprints and other ways to really get out your finding, so that the types of media and modes of communication have totally changed since when I was trained.
Yeah, I agree with everything Chris said. I think communication is incredibly important. I think the other thing is also having a very clear vision or a North Star for your project. Like if it's a 10-year project and your investors or your granting agencies, if they're all on board with your vision and they understand where you're going to be in 5 years, then it's easier to overlook what's happening on a day-to-day or a week-to-week or month-to-month basis, right? And so I think really being able to sell that vision is important, but also surrounding yourself, and maybe this answers your previous question a little too, is surrounding yourself with people who do believe in that vision, right? Who are not just there in an opportunistic kind of way, right? People talk a lot about like finding the right investors for your company. And it's not just anyone who's willing to write a check, it's someone who's bought into your vision. And if you have that kind of a support system, it not only helps you tell your story better, but it also helps you personally, so you're not feeling like a failure all the time until you hit gold.
Yeah, I think one piece that came into my head about this question is that failure actually is part of the storytelling. Mm-hmm. It's really important to have an agreement about the problem and why things are not working, such that you can tell them that the North Star is there. And so if you don't agree really on the problem or the reasons why state of the art is failing, and you don't appreciate that, then it's harder to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to really, in some ways, generate the market or problem statement is really, I think, important to paint a very detailed picture, and that's where all of that time when you're failing is important, because you know that really well by that point.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I'd love to take some questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones that are, maybe 1, 2, that are floating around too. And if you could wait until the microphone comes to you before you ask your question, because we are recording this event this evening. So when you ask your question, please keep that in mind. But if you raise your hand, we'll Microphone will come over, and then we'll take your question.
Hi, I would say, this is very interesting. So this is what science is all about. So I think rather than using the word failure, I would use the word discovering. I mean, that's what really happens. And so I have been on both sides, starting as science and also working for a company. And so, you go from one step to the other. By doing one, you just found out that this doesn't work. But it's really not a failure. It's just going through the process. So I think that's what it's really all about. This is then if you're persistent, then you of course make a big discoveries at the end. So it's very interesting. So I think thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly agree. Other questions or comments?
I'm a retired electrical engineer with a background in signals and image processing. So a lot of the things that I was working on with teams was getting deployed in environments where we did not control the error sources nor the design of experiment from beginning to end. So much of the failures that I encountered were really, we were dealing with confounding variables and error sources upon error sources. And I mean, it sort of became the story of my career. It started in graduate school where I was supposed to do image processing, working at GE, looking at parts on a conveyor belt, and the entire thesis turned into handling noise from the conveyor belt and other sources and figuring out how to work that with the robotic arm. It wasn't at all what I intended to work in. My background moved from the image processing algorithms to control theory, and it just happened forever and ever. We were bringing signals together and trying to extract useful information from them, and it turned out that the big problem was we didn't have good enough clocking circuitries to timestamp them. So again, another 5-10 years go by to get the accuracies we need. And it just again and again and again, in order to realize the end goal, the success, as you would call it, to achieve what we'd hoped to achieve, became decades worth of just nailing down all of these contributing error sources and other variables to separate out. It became the career. Mm-hmm. So I guess you have to take victory from each one of those digressions.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree. I think when you actually have a product out in the field in all sorts of environments, you learn a lot. And for us in biology, we make a particular setback of cells with one patient, for instance. But when you scale it out and get lots of patient samples, you learn how things fail. And then, human genetic variation is actually, and conditions and diseases identify genes that then elucidate pathways that lead to therapeutics. So, understanding modes of change and failure in some ways in terms of particular pathways and functions does lead to innovation. I mean, in a very concrete way in terms of some of the genetic work that we do.
Hi, I think most people have probably heard this quote, and I'll have to paraphrase from Winston Churchill, that the success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And, when you were talking earlier about, how do you stay up on, staying engaged, I was an engineer as well, and I never had problems staying engaged in the I wasn't successful. It's explaining to other people your failures. It was never me personally losing any faith. It's really everyone around you that is the problem. Not the problem, but it's where you have to struggle and say, I'm still engaged. We're going to figure this out, and just hope everybody else stays with you.
It's great how many engineers there are in this room, because I think one of the things that inherently comes with that is trying to solve a problem, right? And I think as engineers, we don't always care if the problem is big or small, just that it's interesting. So no, that completely resonates.
you've described multi-year processes with many failures along the way, and sometimes the success, if you will, is serendipitous. In that kind of environment, talk a little bit about how you'd recognize whether you're making progress or not, and how you know when to finally decide this is a dead end and we should kill it.
Yeah, when is the failure truly a failure?
Yeah,
know.
I think one of the things is, when you're calling something a failure, the first thing to think about is, was that a testable thing, right? Like, did you eliminate an option or a possibility of a solution? Or did you just do something that was, in John's word, like a catastrophic failure, right? A badly designed experiment that doesn't give you any information, just noise, is a failure that maybe doesn't help you get more productive. So I think with every failure, there's a few like checklists you can go through. Like, did that give you a good, did it give you some signal, right? Did it give you some information? Did it prove or disprove something? And then I think lastly, there's the personal motivation topic, right? So at what point do you say, I'm right, I am right, I don't care if the rest of the world thinks, that this is not an interesting problem, versus saying, what are the realities of actually translating your work into impact, right? So if you're not moving towards impact, for me personally, like if there's not a movement towards impact, that's when I would say, if this isn't going to have the impact that I think it should have, I'm going to stop, no matter how interesting the problem is to solve. But that's just me. I know a lot of other scientists who want to do things out of curiosity, and they might stumble on something that I have abandoned, right? So I think there is a little bit of a personal ethos that goes into answering that question.
Yeah, I completely agree with Adhira. There's a number of different ways you revisit and look at what you've done. It's a very tough question. I don't think there's an easy answer to what you asked. In some ways, I think it depends on what else is happening. So like, are there other projects that you have going? What are some other paths that you're pursuing? And in many cases, at least for many of my students and myself, we have multiple projects that you at some point see is leading down a more impactful path. But it's hard, and depends on kind of the resources that you have to push forward or not.
Yeah, I think like one of the things that kind of, for myself, was early in my career, I thought that being a researcher meant that like I had to be the smartest person, right? I had to know things. And I realized early on that actually involving other people, many hopefully smarter than me, in what I was trying to do would help me figure out actually what I was trying to work on. And in particular, like sometimes when you're trying to decide if something isn't good or not, it's good to ask a friend or a colleague to come and look at it and share their thoughts on whether they think this thing is, you should end it or not. And for me, it's more important, not their qualifications or whatever, it's more the logic of their decision making and their thoughts on whether or not it should continue or not. I found that to be the most helpful, and I have plenty of examples of either where somebody really saved my skin or they really helped me truly come to the terms of the fact that I was pursuing a disaster. So, other questions?
Hi, thanks for this discussion. I think it's the first time we're actually really talking about failure in such detail, and it's very reassuring as a researcher working in a biological field. My question was more to do with the opposite of failure, which is success. What exactly is your definition of that? Because we're looking at failure as a gray area, so success also comes with its own gray areas. For instance, in academia, we have this debate about scientific rigor and reproducibility. So if there's an experiment that works once for someone in a lab and it's a game changer in the field, but doesn't necessarily reproduce the same way across other labs, do you still look at that as a success, or how do we really define failure in that context?
Well, you hit upon a really important topic today in American science policy about reproducibility and rigor, it's a gray area. I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons why replication doesn't work. And actually, especially in biology, there's so many sources in which you have materials that might not be the same, environmental conditions that might not be the same, biological variation. And so I actually have a supplemental award from the National Institutes for Health where we're going through a replication study to see whether our protocol is reproducible. And the number of ways in which a different lab interprets the same words or uses arguably the same materials but was kind of synthesized and made in a different batch that could make a big difference, it was eye-opening as we're doing this study. So, at the end of this study, which someone's going to declare a success or not, I think actually we learned a lot just by having someone else try to do the same thing. And in my view, regardless of what happens, it's going to be a success because we learned how to do this better, at least, or as an engineer, try to do it again well in a particular way. So, I think at some level, anyone could point to any paper and say it's not reproducible, and that's, I think, in some ways dangerous if it's not put into the right context. So, in some ways, as you said, I think it's wonderful that you said success is also a gray area because frequently I tell my students, you have a great result, but it's not actually a success until you've published the paper. And that's a painful realization for some folks, but also an energizing one at the end of the process.
Yeah, and I guess from like an entrepreneurship angle, right? Like I cannot name a single company that I have worked with that started out with the same market hypothesis that they ended up with, right? So would you call that a failure? And I think the answer is no. I think it's a gray area for sure, but it's also a graded, thing, right? So if you're making progress towards whatever your bigger vision or North Star is, in my book, that's success. So, including a good experiment, even if you don't publish it.
I think Alfred has a question here in the front.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So, from where I'm coming from, failure is not something we usually talk about in our setting or environment. So, we all look at failure as, okay, it's a lesson we've learned. It's either we move away from it or we move with it. But my question is, how do we move from failure to progress rather than looking at failure as a lesson we are moving with? So an example is Thomas Edison. He tried over 1,000 times just to create an incandescent bulb for us. And he says that I did not fail. I only found 1,000 ways this wouldn't work. So I feel like he moved from failure to progress. The more he failed, he rather found ways of avoiding or not allowing this to work. And so my question is, how do we find the spot from failure to progress rather than just seeing it as a lesson and moving from or with it?
Yeah, I love that Edison quote, by the way. I think part of that, again, goes back to this idea of was it a testable hypothesis, right? So if he's testing a certain filament for the bulb and it didn't work, great. That's a testable hypothesis. He's got information, right? He's gathering data from that. But I do want to emphasize kind of this idea of data and information as you kind of think about like failure, thinking of failure as data gathering rather than like a yes or no or black and white. We've talked about gray areas and success in the same way. You know, just how do you approach observations? How do you approach data? And all of the examples we've heard today of productive failure, I think that's what it comes down to. Being able to recognize when a failure is actually an important observation or an important signal, and then following where those crumbs lead you.
Yeah, building on that, I think in the stories I shared, you have to be, and my students, I think, pretty dispassionate and objective when you observe what's in front of you. And I think it has to come with a mental model of what are the possibilities and what are you eliminating, and how things come together and work together. And you know, that gets refined and changed over time. But if you don't start noting down and gathering the data in a regular way, and systematic way, then it's much harder to get to progress.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one more little thing. So, like with startups, I would hear this a lot where you go do customer discovery. Like you go talk to the customer about what their problem is. And, you know, being objective and unbiased is so important there, because if you're trying to listen for the things that you think are the right solution, as opposed to being a neutral or objective observer, it can lead you down a very wrong path, right? Oh, this one person said that this is exactly the problem that, you know, I'm trying to solve, and they have it. Okay, well, what did the other 99 people say, right? So I just wanted to emphasize that objectiveness is not just a quality in science, but also in entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
I wanted to shift the gears over to and build upon your experience in working with all those startups to ask a question about intellectual property versus trade secrets. Because in my experience, I worked with a fellow founder, and we came up with an encryption algorithm too early. And then we got just bled dry because everyone encouraged us to make sure you not only get the US but international patents, and you know how the fees begin to roll up on that. And then they'll get you again when we should plan for your continuation patents. And at the same time, the other path would have been not to hold on to the technology so guardedly, but build out a first product. In our case, it might have been a piece of middleware that could have been used more broadly across an industry base, or maybe have pursued that partnership with a large company that was going to pretty much take the whole darn thing because it hadn't been productized yet, leaving us as founders feeling horribly insulted and not feeling like we were going to benefit in the long run, that we would lose control of our baby. And so I think this affects a lot of people, where they don't know how much they can reveal of what they've done, how they should collaborate, whether they should patent, whether they should obfuscate the technology and embed it in some way so that they maintain control, so that they can carry it further to market. I just wonder how much you run into those issues as they go from startups and grow.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I think pretty much any tech startup grapples with, right? Is your secret sauce in your invention, or is it in your execution, right? And I think that's a decision point. And if it's in the execution, you move fast, and you move with partners, and you trust people, and you do stuff, right? If it truly is in this algorithm that you think nobody else has come up with, then maybe it is more of a pathway to take where you're protecting the intellectual property there. Now, the mechanisms will depend on, you know, the type of innovation. But I do think this goes back to the other point. Like, there are so many places you can fail on the way to commercialization, and, you know, if the IP and if the IP strategy isn't correct, yes, it could lead to failure. But even if you get it correct, you've got another 100 landmines ahead of you. There's no right answer. It's a very tough question, and I think at the end of the day, the founders have to, again, go back to, are they being objective, right? Like you called it a baby, and I hear this all the time, and I say, nope, it is not your baby, right? Once you fall in love with the solution as opposed to the problem you're trying to solve or that vision you have or the big picture, things can start to get blurry. So keep the vision first and foremost is what I would say.
Wow. Well, thank you. Well, I think it's a great point to close. We're up on time. I would just share just two things with you. One is that I hope that you walk away here not feeling any shame and failure. The few times I've talked with somebody and they've kind of tried to make me feel bad about something I failed on, I pretty much walked away with the conclusion that they themselves hadn't really tried something big before. And the typical reaction I get when I share failure with somebody is they look at me and they say, look, like, let me give you an example of the way I failed 10 times worse in the situation that you're in, and and then they help you out. So that's the response from you. That's when you know you're talking to the right person. The other thing I want to share with you is that this is part of a series that we're kicking off tonight on failure. And in our next part of the series in February, it'll be an exciting topic on failure in artificial intelligence. And there's a wonderful, beautiful computer science building right next door to us. I'm sure they've got plenty of failures to share with us. So please come back for that program. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
That was great.